Hi, everybody. This is Jen again, and welcome to episode number 13 of Reappropriate the podcast. This is the first podcast episode of the new year, and I'm really excited today to have on the podcast my very special guest, Arthur Chu, who is formerly definitely Jeopardy champion, but also has become infamous in the last year for some really outstanding writing with the Daily Beast as well as other newspapers and websites. So Arthur, I wanted to give you a chance to maybe introduce yourself, let us know what you've been up to before and since Jeopardy, maybe sort of introduce yourself and let us know where we can find you.
Okay. You can find me at Arthur_Affect on Twitter. And you can also, look for my voiceover website. That's arthur-chu.com. So I've been a freelance voiceover artist for a while. I've done a lot of local community theater and kind of thing. And I've, been ranting on the internet for a long time. But after I was on Jeopardy last year, people actually started, publishing what I wrote. So that's been pretty cool.
So where were you writing before Jeopardy?
I was just on Twitter. I was writing Facebook posts. I was participating in forums and that kind of thing. I'd actually gotten a few random letters to the editor published and that kind of thing, but nothing big, And Jeopardy kind of just exploded my profile and got me a place in the Daily Beast. I've written for Salon a bit. I'm working on a book proposal, so we'll see what happens with that in the coming year. So.
And I understand that there's somebody trying to make a documentary about you as well. Is that still going on, or is that on hold?
Yeah, they're actually going to be following me around to a couple of speaking gigs. Oh, there's my cat in the background. There's going to be, I'm doing some speaking gigs at Notre Dame and at Case Western near where I live in Cleveland. And I'm going to be at MagFest, which was the video game convention where I proposed to my wife coming up this month. And so there's a documentary crew that's following me around that wants to make a movie about, the weird and surreal stuff that's happened to me in 2014. So that's exciting.
And that is actually the perfect segue for the topic that I kind of wanted to tackle today with Arthur. Arthur, you've been very involved into masculinity and feminism within the gaming community over the last year. But I think where we crossed paths, or one of the places that we crossed paths, was in TWIB, which is This Week in Blackness. There was an After Dark podcast from Jayla Ree, and we were both on as guests, and we were talking about interracial dating and sexuality, and we had a really, really phenomenal conversation, one that really stuck in my mind as one of the most amazing conversations I've had on the subject of interracial dating in the 13 years that I've been blogging. And so tonight I really wanted to sort of do kind of a sequel to draw on some of the issues that we brought up in that podcast, as well as in my first podcast on interracial dating, which had guests Juliet Shen and a couple of other folks earlier last year, where we also talked about it, but we sort of talked about it more in a context of gender dynamics and male sexuality. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about you and I, Arthur, is that we're both actually in interracial relationships. You mentioned your wife, who you haven't been private about, is white, and my fiance, who I just got engaged over the holiday, by the way, guys, yay!
Right, yeah.
So, yeah, so it sounds a little bit.
I haven't been thinking about it, yeah.
I'm sorry?
I did know. I saw it on Facebook, but I haven't,
Oh, yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
It sounds like really self-interested. I'm like, hey, I got engaged. Let's have a podcast about interracial dating. I swear to God that wasn't how that was planned. But, so we're both in these long-term interracial couples, but they're not sort of your stereotypical pairing that folks in the Asian American community typically talk about. I think that when we were talking in TWIB, and even when we were talking in my earlier podcast episode, we typically talk about the white male, Asian female pairing, and then sort of go from there in terms of gender dynamics. So I was wondering if you've also observed the same thing, and why you think it is that we focus on this particular pairing over all the other ones within our community.
I mean, they actually did like they OkCupid. So it's kind of shady that they do it, but there's the guy who runs OkCupid does a lot of data mining from his site, and he found like, hey, judging just by the number of people who reply to messages versus the number of messages those people send, white guys are the most desirable people in the world, which is not surprising if you think about how race and gender work. But yeah, that white men have to send out very few messages in return for the number of messages they get back. White women are like, slightly below that, and then anyone of any other race and gender combination is below that, with black women at the bottom. And it's like a very predictable stacking, but that's how it works. And so, demographically, I think they did surveys until recently, and yes, it was much more common for Asian women to date white men than Asian men to date white women. And it's white men who are kind of writing the stories and who are, we get these colonialist narratives like Madame Butterfly, right? And it's always like the white man's the protagonist, and it's an exotic woman from some other part of the world that sort of serves as a stand-in for, the new experience, the new part of the world that he's pushing out into. And so it's both that we don't pay as much attention to other ways people of different races and genders can interact, and it's also because we don't pay attention, people don't think about it. It's not something that crosses people's minds. And I remember, I guess the group of guys that I was with wasn't particularly typical because every Asian American community is different, but I remember coming back home from college and hanging out with some guys from my old church, and just like being shocked that my girlfriend, now my wife, was white, and just like, how do you even ask a white girl out? And they're like, it wasn't
presumably how you would ask everybody else out.
Yeah, but and the sort of implied like hierarchy there, like I remember a guy literally said, I can't even get a Chinese girl, and Arthur's dating white girls, like can't even, like it's something you graduate to, so there's that.
Well, so I mean, as someone who's not an Asian guy, so I really don't know how, I can't speak from this experience. One thing that I've always wondered, there's a lot of conversation online about how fraught it is for Asian American men to date, and there's this whole idea of social capital and social privilege, and Asian American men being particularly socially underprivileged. This is sort of the terminology that's used. And one thing that struck me is that I obviously have Asian American male friends who are not as politically, involved in conversations online, and I always find that there's a little bit of a disconnect between the sort of the intensity of the conversation that's online versus the intensity of the conversation that's in real life. And I fully admit that it's quite possible that people are freer to express how they really feel online than they are expressing themselves in real life. But as an Asian American guy, like, do you buy into this idea of the socially underprivileged Asian American man when it comes to the dating scene?
I mean, it's hard because it's probably the most personal thing you can talk about, right? It's the most.
Well, I don't mean to be like, you personally, like, tell me about your life, but like.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very hard to speak in generalities when you're talking about, your life or even your friends' lives, because you look at any individual person and you ask, why aren't they more successful in the dating scene? What are their frustrations? And you can't separate race or class in general from that specific person's issues. And so I've known Asian American guys who were, Casanovas, who had a huge list of ex-lovers behind them, and I've known the stereotypical, nerdy, shy Asian guy, but the nerdy and shy does a lot of work there, the nerdy and shy black guys, nerdy and shy multiracial guys, nerdy and shy white guys. So what's the difference there? I mean, I do think the reason you see more of this kind of conversation online is that online, we have a bigger pool to look at. And so I can join a conversation of like 100 Asian guys and know I might have like a million things that I don't have in common with them, but we can still focus on the things that we do have in common. And that's, in some ways, that's sometimes a distortion of the story, but it's also like, yeah, these are things that have happened to me. They're a small part of my life. but you multiply that by a million different Asian American men, and you see a pattern, and you see an issue, and you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, so the stereotype threat. I mean, that there, I do feel like when you're an Asian American guy and you look at the media, you don't have a lot of examples of masculinity to aspire to. You know, that there's a few extremes. There's like the kung fu movie or whatever, this very exoticized thing. There's the Asian American nerd, and then for the most part, Asian Americans as objects of desire on the screen are Asian American women. And otherwise, men as objects of desire are white guys or black guys, or there's different models of masculinity, but the Asian American man's just kind of invisible there. And so you kind of, yeah, there's an inferiority complex. And, you know, I've seen, like, the YouTube videos that take it really far and joke about it, like feeling self-conscious about not having enough body hair to be a man or not being tall enough to be a man. But, you know, these are things that, you know, it might be, you know, it's a chicken or egg thing, right? Do we think that being tall is good because Caucasians are demographically taller than Asians, or is it more that that's something that, you know, white guys are able to, whatever. But Asian American men are typically, on average, my height and not 6 feet tall. And so, you know, someone like my brother who is 6 feet tall gets to be, you know, the tallest guy in the room and gets to, you know, he's playing against an Asian type. And it's almost like you decide strategies, right? Like I've talked with my African American friends, like, how do you navigate, you know, the stereotype of what it means to be black? Do you fight against it? Do you go with it? And I've known Asian American guys who, you know, get very into, like, defending a certain stereotype. Like, okay, if people want me to be smart, and then I'm gonna be smart. I'm gonna be, like, hostile to the, you know, hostile to the jocks, hostile to the hipsters, and I'm gonna be very much about the straight and narrow. And more, I think among my generation, you see people who are, like, pushing against that, the like bro thing, right? It's almost an ironic, like, I'm not supposed to be a frat boy kind of guy, so I'm gonna be super that, you know. I'm going to, like, and it's funny, and sometimes it's the guy who's trying too hard, you know. But sometimes it really is, it's authentic because it's who he really wants to be. But yeah, you've noticed that there's a lot more, you know, raver girls who are Asian, a lot more bros who are Asian, and it's like we're trying to find a definition of what it means to be American, a subculture that's not defined by this very narrow thing that we were handed as the model minority kind of thing. You know,
Well, and I think
but yeah, that's, yeah.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, we're in a sort of generation or an era now where I think that our definitions of masculinity and femininity have really not only altered but diversified a lot. Like, the idea of the masculine geek is something that is very mainstream at this point. And so one of the things that you brought up that I sort of question is, like, you know, who's really defining these these ideas of what masculine really entails? Like, who decides or continues to believe that masculine is really tall, or that body hair really defines this? Because, you know, I can speak as someone who's a heterosexual cis woman, and what attracts and appeals to me is not necessarily what mainstream, and it's not actually what mainstream predominantly white America finds attractive, you know, like, and I think that there's plenty of room within that more diversified masculinity, where it's not just one type, that permits room for not just American men, but men of all colors, to really find a masculinity that's defined less by trying to be something else, but more by trying to be themselves, you know? Yeah. And I feel the same way about femininity. Like, I feel like one thing that we're moving towards, but what we're also pushing towards, is a broadening of what feminine sexuality and sexiness really is. So it's not defined solely by appearance, and it's not even defined specifically by a very, you know, 36, 24, 36 kind of appearance. That big can be beautiful. People of color can be beautiful. Women can be beautiful who aren't hyper feminine either. You can be kind of butch or androgynous, and you can be beautiful as well. So it strikes me as an interesting conversation to have relative to the Asian American community, because sort of as we touched on in both of our earlier podcasts, we were sort of touching on this idea of diversifying what we think of as masculine and feminine. And I wonder whether or not that idea has really made its way fully into the Asian American community when it comes to the interracial dating issue, or whether or not we're still stuck on trying to define Asian American masculine, like in trying to create a masculine pop culture Asian American identity with like Sulu and Star Trek and other really hyper masculine images, whether or not we're sort of trying to limit ourselves to this more conventional masculinity that ultimately will several stand do the service, because we're not diversified. We're just trying to chase non-Asian ideal. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean it's tough.
But go ahead.
Well, what I kind of wanted to say was like the growing up in a culture and having a sense of what's culturally normal or the cultural like ideal is, at some point you tell yourself, okay, dating isn't really a contest. It's not like whoever has had the most conquests at the end of their life wins, like some people imagine it, right? You're looking for the one right person. I'm married, and I know a lot of people who are married, or who are in long-term relationships, or who are happy, with the relationships that they've had, who don't fit the mold, and yet there's like this abstract thing, like it's like when women talk about what it means to be attractive, it doesn't really, when I say to my wife, oh, you're the right woman for me, I don't care how you look, okay, but at the same time, I don't define that whole sense of self-esteem for her or for any other woman, that she can still feel bad about how she looks, and I can't magically fix that, by saying it's not true. And it's the same vice versa. It's like there's always some part of you that's going to think, am I attractive, period? Am I masculine, period? Am I feminine, period? Even if you know you're masculine enough or the right kind of masculine for your partner, there's still that sense of the world judging you. I mean, it's like, when we ask about Asian American masculinity, the thing that rings in my head is this, Jeremy Lin, right? We all kind of latched onto that story, and it's because all this time we've been saying, it's enough to do this, it's enough to do that, it's enough to have all these other forms of success. But there was there was no Asian American NBA player, who was famous, and that was like a thing we didn't even really talk about how we were missing that until it happened, right? Like we had Yao Ming, and he was from China, and he wasn't an Asian American. People actually said it makes such a big difference that Jeremy Lin is the guy who heard the nasty, Asian American jokes, and lived through that, and still that he was the one who grew up in the predominantly white culture and succeeded at something he wasn't supposed to. And the big story that when Jeremy Lin had one of his really big nights, some sportscaster went for the easy, shitty joke. Some lady's gonna feel 2 inches of pain tonight, right? You remember that? And
no, I did not know that happened at all.
It was but yeah, it was like, even in his moment of triumph, someone's got to bring him down, and go for the easy joke and be like, well, he's still got a tiny penis because he's Asian, no matter how successful he is.
Oh.
And that's the thing. It's like,
that sucks.
Any girl, Jeremy Lin has lots of female admirers. If Jeremy Lin had a girlfriend, I don't know if he's dating anybody right now, but it's like, she is not going to base her opinion on what some asshole sportscaster says. It's obviously a shitty joke, right? It's not important in that sense, but it is important because it's like there's millions of people laughing at that. No matter what he does, no matter what he accomplishes, there's going to be people who turn around and look at you and make that stupid joke and laugh. It's like why every stupid stereotype joke stings. Why fried chicken and watermelon still stings. Why. It's like that's always kind of there, hanging in the background. That it's something it might even be that not anyone actually believes it, You know, like I don't think most people actually think that there's a significant difference in penis size among guys of different races, or that it matters that much, but that they could, even whether or not they believe it, they think it's funny, that it's a tool they can use against you. You know, that's the nature of what stereotypes do, and that's the real thing. It's like, it's not that most, you know, Asian American guys I know are like paralyzed by this stuff or are unable to find partners. Most of us do find partners. Most of us in general find partners in the end, and we work out our issues with whoever it is we're with. So it's not about that issue between you and that one other person. It's about still, how does this affect your life, the way that you're seen when people look at you, over the course of your life. All these people that you shouldn't care about, but in aggregate, it's millions of people. Especially if you end up famous, and then it actually really is millions of people talking about, you know. How do you deal with it?
Which,
you know?
by the way, you know, like I was telling you just before we started that I secretly I stalk you on Twitter, actually, and read your timeline pretty much daily. And it's always shocking to me the number of people and you were saying it's not that many people, but who seem to have nothing better to do but than to follow you around and make some truly horrible and racist jokes against you. And I've just been completely flabbergasted by the tenacity of these trolls, and like they have nothing better to do, which is awful. So I'm sorry that that's happening to you.
I've blocked most of them, but no, it's.
But
No, it's a hazard of any kind of celebrity, no matter how small. Like, you know, I wrote a thing about Felicia Day a while back. I'd read an article by Felicia Day where she said, you know, if you're on the internet at all, it doesn't matter who you are. People use the term echo chamber or bubble, and it's the opposite of that. It's if you have any visibility on the internet, someone's going to try to cut you down immediately, and they're going to do it in the most blunt and obvious. They're going to find what the easiest weak point is. And so if you are, you know, a person of color in this country, it's going to be race. Someone's going to say something racist to you. If you get noticed on the internet, and you're going to get racist stuff. It's inevitable. And so that's kind of what I mean. It's that I don't care about these people as individuals, but it's like they have that to reach and grab. If you're a woman, it's going to be about your appearance, and it's going to be about your sexual history. People don't know anything about you, but they'll just look at you, and they'll find something to say to get that rise out of you, because that's how people are. And that's why it matters almost.
People are assholes.
Yeah, it's like I want to say like Asian American dating doesn't matter to me anymore because I don't date, because I'm married, but it does matter because it's a thing that they can talk about. You know, it's a thing that's part of how you're seen, you know.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like it's interesting because I have been in my relationship for as long as the blog has been up, and I've almost never blogged about it because it felt like this one thing that was too personal to put out there. And I think I agree with you that like putting that out there as a topic of conversation just sort of invites people to sort of dissect and debate your personal life. And I always wanted to keep that separate from what I was doing as a blogger. And it also felt a little bit like to invite people to talk about, you know, my relationship was to sort of racialize it in a way, like to say, hey, look, I'm in this relationship, and doesn't this make me noteworthy in some way? And that's just not something that I've felt very comfortable doing. But at the same time, you're right that like being on the internet, you invite people who will come in and basically find these things out about you anyways. And so, you know, whether or not I want to have people to know that I'm in an interracial relationship and the race of my partner, people know anyways. And so it sort of occurred to me a little bit last year that if that's the case, we might as well start to deal with some of those issues.
Yeah.
So one thing I kind of wanted to bring up relative to what you're talking about is this idea of how often we see you know, kind of like where I started the podcast a little bit, like the representation of the kinds of couples that we see that intersect with the Asian American community, and how we rarely see reflected in pop culture the kinds of relationship makeup that you and I are in terms of race and gender. So like there's plenty of of examples of white men and Asian women. You mentioned Miss Saigon, and going further back to like earlier stuff like Madame Butterfly, and even further back, like basically to the onset of the Silk Road and Orientalism, you can find examples of Asian femininity and sexuality being used as a form of colonialization and oppression by white guys, and a simultaneous emasculation of Asian men. But today we don't really see the converse relationship where it's Asian American men paired romantically with non Asian American, maybe white or black or Latina Native women, and you also don't see Asian American women too often paired with non-white men. And so I feel like white man, Asian female coupling and all of the dynamics involved sort of suck up all the air in the conversation when it comes to interracial dating. And so I wonder, we talked a little bit about Selfie, I think maybe before the podcast started. Do you think that something like Selfie with John Cho as the romantic male protagonist, the first Asian American man to play a romantic lead in a sitcom, do you think that's a really important step for the Asian American community and to deal with some of these stereotypes that we're talking about?
I mean, I feel like even having the character is a step. And I mean, the thing that I said at the beginning was like, well, okay, these two characters are both still playing stereotypes, that it's an Asian guy who is sort of uptight and nerdy and, emotionally repressed, and it's a white girl who, is impulsive and crazy and obsessed with, with her looks and what people think about her, and those are both very much stereotypes. But if you have the characters and they're there and front and center as the main characters instead of in the background, then, if you're any good at writing, eventually they will develop nuance beyond those stereotypes. And I've started to watch, Selfie, including the episodes on Hulu after it was canceled on ABC. And yeah, it got to be a better and better show as time went on because, you got to see more of them than just those stereotypes. And that's sort of the thing. It's that when we rail against stereotypes, a lot of people think, oh, the solution to a stereotype is to reject it completely, is to like go to the opposite of the stereotype. Then you haven't really. You've just inverted the stereotype, But stereotypes tend to exist because they describe, demographic realities that exist. That most Asian American immigrants who came here post the 1960s were cherry picked for the brain drain, and so we have a sort of nerdy culture here among at least Northeast Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Asian Americans, and that's created this thing that we all live with, this model minority stereotype that we live with, and we're all going to relate to that one way or the other, and it's going to be there. And the question is like, what is there about a character that's deeper than that? What is there about a character where they're self-aware about that and they're struggling with it instead of just plain embodying it? And I think we had a lot of black writers and creators talk about that, with what it means to be black. Starting with the Cosby Show, which was very much like this like blast against the stereotype. We're going to go against the stereotype, but then getting more nuance from that point forward. What does it mean to be black and rich? What does it mean to be black and educated? What does it mean to be black and in a relationship with a white person? We're starting to do that now. I think we're just like a few steps behind in the Asian American community, because until a little while ago we were invisible completely, but we're starting to sort of get there. So yeah, I like the show, and I wish it hadn't been canceled, just because that potential was there. Even with a generation back, All American Girl, that show was mishandled from like beginning to end. That was Margaret Cho's sitcom. But just the fact that she was there on TV and talking about stuff, there was some, I watched every episode of that show. I was way too young for the show, but just like it was exciting because there was an Asian American family on TV, and just having them there meant that, as long as the show went on, you would get more than what we had before, which is like the one Asian American person in the background, or
Right.
That's tends to be like, this is why I'm never really against it when they put something on TV, even if it looks like it's going to be bad. Like just giving it the chance to like do it is better than not doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one thing that I found in the community, which you're not saying, I actually think it's really cool that we're both, it seems, in agreement on this, but what seems to come out in the community a lot is there's almost this shorthand when it comes to dealing with pop culture and Asian Americans and interracial dating, where we're almost so tired of seeing the white male Asian female trope that we start to sort of shorthand label that as stereotypical and regressive whenever it happens. You know, like, oh, of course, again, there's the white guy and the Asian female and they're dating. And it happens a lot, to be true, but I think that we instinctually call that regressive when in some instances it is absolutely regressive and it's just playing into this same sort of like appropriation of Asian American female sexuality for white masculinity. But I also think that when we shorthand that, we miss the possibility of having Asian American women exploring Asian American identity through relationships with non-Asian men, sometimes white men, sometimes not. And so, you know, for example, online, there's a lot of conversation about, you know, Joy Luck Club or, you know, a handful of Asian American chick lit, which include white male protagonists. And I'm of the same mind that I wouldn't necessarily throw it all out just because of the makeup of the protagonists, but to maybe give it a chance to see whether or not even within this trope you can explore issues of identity in a way that is novel and contributes to the conversation. And by the same token, I wonder if, even though we're so not used to seeing images of Asian men and white women on television, are we so excited by something like John Cho and Selfie that, and just to see an Asian American in a romantic light, that we're almost, you know, sweeping under the rug any possible regressiveness that might occur within the show, which I've only seen the pilot. But what really worried me was the argument that John Cho's character was noteworthy and this was going to be a huge blow in favor of reclaiming or advancing Asian American masculinity, was that it still seemed to suggest that an Asian American man is seen as more masculine if he's able to cultivate a sexual relationship with a woman. So it seemed to fit into sort of that same hierarchy of sexuality and race that we talked about earlier with the OkCupid stuff. And I wonder, is our community maybe not capable of, or not having those conversations as nuanced as maybe we could be?
Yeah, this is why it's a fraught issue, because anytime you're dealing with other people's sexual relationships or romantic relationships and, you know, making like these broad judgments about them. I mean, okay, so like yellow fever, which is not a great term, but yeah, I'm aware there are creepy white guys out there. I've met them. You know, I've been in a class about Asian American history and met the guy who's there to meet the Asian girls, and it's weird. Okay, so I know it's a real thing, but it's even worse, I think, when some Asian guys get over the top angry about it. And I know, like, I'm guilty of, you know, feeling that resentment before, but you go online and you see there's a stereotype, there's Asian guys who won't shut up about it, right? And that's the whole, like, you know, back and forth between Asian guys and Asian girls, which one of you hates the other one the more, you know, but like getting obsessed and stalking, like, why aren't you dating an Asian guy? Why are you dating a white guy? You know, I'm like,
yeah.
To get ugly with it, I mean, Elliot Rodger was absolutely obsessed with that, and that took him to where he ended up, you know, that he couldn't just look at other people and not think about this hierarchy of race and how someone is subtly putting him down by choosing someone else over him. He had this huge resentment of black men, you know, who were getting girls that he was supposed to get, that kind of thing. But yeah, like, anytime it starts sounding like you're supposed to date me and you're, you know, and it's
or yeah, and at least I you know, so we were talking about trolls earlier, and like virtually all of my trolls are of that ilk, and it has that sort of tenure of like, you're supposed to be dating, maybe not me because they don't really say that, but like, you're supposed to be dating someone like me, and there's something wrong with you if you're not. what I also find really interesting is, at least for me, and maybe this is just interesting to me, is that that kind of trolling seems to really be informed by who I'm actually dating. So I've been accused of dating white guys, and I'm like, dude, I've never dated a white guy. Also never dated anyone besides my fiance. So 100% of my boyfriends have been black, but also named James. So it's really odd that there's this sort of shaming that goes on, I think, within our community, almost from both sides, I would say. I can speak from my experience being like on the receiving end of what seems like shaming from this small population of really angry guys towards Asian American women that seems to want to silence Asian American women through basically shaming them for their sexualities, whatever that may be, or assumptions of what that sexuality really is. And it seems to only, it uses this idea of like white supremacy to almost reinforce white supremacy, because at the same time that they're accusing women of only wanting to date white guys, they're assuming that the Asian American woman would be dating up, or believe that they would be dating up by dating white guys, you know. So it's so bizarre to me that within our community we still have these dynamics between women and men, and it's like intersections between masculinity and feminism, and I feel like we're having the same conversation that Frank Chin and Matthew Huntington were having like 25 years ago.
Yeah, it's hard because, like I said, it's the most personal, for most of us, it's the most personal subject, is who are you going to spend your life with, who do you love? And so it is political. The personal is always political. It's always tied to a world outside of you, but you can't, not in this like simple one-to-one reductive way. And so one of the things I regret is, you know, I was one of the guys who was giving shit to Amy Tan way back, and it's not really her fault that even today the one Asian American writer a lot of people have heard of is Amy Tan, right? This is the curse of success. It's being the one successful one. So your work, you know, becomes judged for all of its shortcomings for failing to represent all Asian Americans, just like, you know, Girls on HBO doesn't represent all 20-something women in this country, so it's a failure. You know, it's like putting all this burden on one person. And Amy Tan is a person who had a specific story that she was telling, and that she's told other, you know, more nuanced stories since then, but at the time she was basing it very heavily on her own experience, and she is a woman who is married to a white guy. And so for her, because she, you know, fell in love with that guy, yeah, marrying that guy was, you know, a sense of liberation, a sense of moving forward in life. You know, the guy's presented very sympathetically in the book, and a lot of us, all we could see was like, oh, here's an Asian woman telling a story about how marrying a white guy is the best thing in the world. You know, thanks a lot. You know, and like almost to the point of saying that this is a story about women who are abused by Asian men and then find, you know, freedom and happiness from, you know, being apart from Asian men. And that's not really what it's about. But unfortunately, there weren't Asian men foregrounded in the story, you know, because it wasn't a story written by an Asian man for Asian men. And it was being held up as being for Asians, period, you know, by the mainstream media. Like, this is the Asian story. And so when it's sold to you like that, and you read it and you find these things that don't resonate with you, the big one being it's about Asian American women and I'm not a woman, but, you know, many other things. It's from people from her part of the country, from, you know, her point in time and space. But anytime it's like this story has to be universal and it's not, you're going to get this kind of unfair backlash against the author. And I think the unfortunate thing is, you know, it's just that there's too few stories. Selfie, you know, how much do we expect from just one sitcom? No one asks one sitcom with white characters, hey, does this fully represent, you know, white people? Is this leaving out an important slice of the white experience? Because there's going to be another one, you know. But with us, everything is so kind of like high stakes, and that's kind of, you can't live up to that, you know. Almost you just have to.
Yeah, and I think that with Amy Tan, it's really interesting because she's touted strangely as like an Asian American, like the Asian American feminist text, which is not reflective of Asian American feminism. So if you're a guy out there who thinks that Amy Tan's Book Club is like the seminal text for Asian American feminism, you need to read more, because it's not. I think there's a lot of, you're right. I think that Amy Tan's book, Maxine Hong Kingston's book, other famous Asian American literary texts that are famous in the mainstream more so than they are famous as Asian American literature, we have room to criticize, but we should be criticizing the publishing companies and the marketing companies, because these are texts that, yes, are speaking from a perspective of an Asian American woman and have something very valid to say about Asian American female identity, but it's not meant to be representative of even all Asian American women, let alone all Asian Americana. But these are books that also sell better to the non-Asian mainstream because they fit into these colonialist ideas that you mentioned earlier, in a way that a book like Native Speaker or The Barbarians Are Coming don't. And these are, for those who are watching who aren't familiar with these are texts. One was written by Chang Rei Lee, the other by, I forget his name right now, but they both deal with Asian American male sexuality within the context of an Asian American male protagonist in relationships with white women, and deal with Asian American identity and sexuality that way. But the vast majority of people who are reading Asian American books have never heard of, at least, Barbarians Are Coming. They might have heard of Native Speaker, which is a truly phenomenal text too. So, like, the idea that we're looking for one, or we're only given one thing, and we're trying to make it be everything, like, you're right. We're not in control. Amy Tan isn't in control of how her book is marketed and who the target audience ends up being. She's only in control of what she writes and the experience she can write from. And as a community, rather than to blame Amy Tan for talking about and exploring her identity, we should be promoting these other authors who exist. Or, in the sitcom world, we need to be promoting the other sitcoms that exist that can talk about the Asian American experience and Asian American male sexuality, and diversifying how we think of ourselves in terms of gender, as well as the relationships that we're in. So, like, I know that Fresh Off the Boat is upcoming in Selfie's slot. And I don't know, have you seen that? Yeah.
Fresh Off the Boat? No, I haven't. No.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on it while we're on the subject?
I'm excited about it, sort of tentatively so. It's going to grab your attention with a title like that, right? And I had to explain to people okay, that's a very offensive thing to say within our community, to call someone fresh off the boat. So it's already sort of very kind of fraught there, and I'm interested in it because, like I said, I watched All American Girl when it came out. I'm interested in the idea of the dynamics of a family sitcom with an Asian American family with this kind of degree of specificity, that it's about a dad who's going to start a restaurant. It's about a dad who's, I think I remember reading, who's into cowboy culture, half ironically but also sincerely, and wants to do this thing, swim against the current of what he's supposed to be, and a son who's kind of being dragged along with that. And to me, that's interesting. That's you've already got a hook there where it's about identity. It's about identity instead of just playing out identity. It's about someone who's a family that's aware of their identity and what's being pushed on them and pushing back against it. And to me, as long as you start off with those at least two layers, not just I am this, but I'm aware that this is what I am and this is how I feel about what I am, then you have room to grow. And a lot of times we don't get beyond that. All American Girl is either supposed to be she is Asian and she does Asian things, or she isn't actually Asian. She doesn't fit the stereotype. She does these other things, but not much about the interplay between those things. And
right.
It's I never meet an Asian who completely breaks the stereotypes and is unaware of the stereotypes, just like I never meet someone who completely fits all the stereotypes. We all kind of occupy that area in between, so.
And, I haven't seen Fresh Off the Boat either. I think that it's actually kind of a cool sitcom idea, in the sense that, unlike virtually all the other Asian American sitcoms that we've been exposed to, or shows in general, this one is, I think, from the ground up, Asian American writers, creators, producers, actors. And so I feel like this is really being told from our community, and in a way that other projects really haven't been. And I sort of said, I think, when it first came out, that there are lots of people right now who are calling the show title racist, but I almost feel like if you were to look for the truly authentic Asian American title for a show that was dealing with Asian American identity, it would have to be called Fresh Off the Boat, because it deals with the whole ABC versus FOB, and I know I just used slurs, but like the banana versus FOB kind of tension within our community, which is about hyphenation, and it's about identity and exploring what it means to be Asian or Asian American. And I think we're still at a juncture within our community where we're still trying to figure out what it means to be Asian American, like whether or not being recently immigrated makes you more Asian than someone who's been born in the States. Mm-hmm. And I think that this show, unlike virtually all the other shows that we've had, is really going to tackle that. So I'm really excited about that aspect of it. I think the part of it, I'm worried about one thing, and it's just I feel like the Eddie Huang character, who is the son character, is a little bit appropriative of hip-hop culture, and I worry about how that's going to play. So I'm kind of that's my issue right now.
Well,
and then I also
the thing with Eddie Huang in real life, but that's another story. But
yeah, I mean, we've kind of wandered off from interracial dating. We've been talking a little bit about sort of how externally the people view different interracial relationships. I thought maybe in the last couple of minutes we could talk a little bit about our own experience within the community being in these sort of non-traditional interracial relationships. I know that for me, one thing that really frustrates me and why I sort of have stayed out of the interracial dating conversation online, that again, the conversation focuses almost entirely on an Asian woman and the sort of gender sexual politics of that. And I've rarely, if ever, dealt with or found a community even of people who are interested in talking about, the particular experiences and identity that my relationship sort of represents. So as I said, I'm dating, or I'm affianced, I'm engaged to a black man now, and his African American identity, I think, is treated in a way that's different than the white identity is treated in the Asian American community. Like, we spent a year talking about anti-blackness in Ferguson, and sort of an undercurrent within that is whether or not the Asian American community has latent, inherently internalized this, like the same white supremacy and anti-blackness of the larger community. And that's definitely been like a day-to-day experience for me, is sort of trying to navigate Asian American attitudes towards the African American community and culture in a way that I don't think that couples that don't involve two people of color have to really deal with. And so I think part of me is just really frustrated with how the conversation about out marriage focuses so heavily on a person of color with a white person, and we almost don't even have any foundation for talking about two people who are both minorities being in an interracial relationship.
Right. I mean, it's the white as neutral thing, right? And
yeah.
It's almost like when I'm posed with that question, it's like, do I want to date someone who's like me or someone who's normal? It's like that's the choice, right? Do we both want to be different from the rest of society, or am I going to try to join normal society? And there's never this like, well, what about all the other things that a woman might be besides, But I mean, that's almost like thinking back on my own life, it's almost like that's how it was presented to me, and that's almost how I framed it. There's almost like this like regret in my mind, because I don't know how typical my story is, but my parents would try to set me up with their friends' kids, and it would be phrased as, you don't want to hang out with those girls from school because they're from a different culture, they don't really understand you. You want to, I want you to make friends with and possibly date this girl that you've never met before, but who is just like you because she was, the daughter of one of our sets of friends and raised like you in a similar situation as you, child of immigrants. And I was always kind of like pushing against that. I was like, okay, I'm not defined by you guys, by my parents. I'm not defined by who my parents are friends with. I'm not defined by the country my parents are from. The way I grew up, I was always in schools with predominantly white populations, and so I was like, no, my peer group is these people. So my, friends and my girlfriend, they're going to come from among these people, and those people were almost all white people. But this is the thing. It's like, so that's how it ended up. That's how I framed it in my mind. I don't think that's the reason that, like, once you get to know a person for themselves, you're with them for themselves. But at the same time, it's like, so I was stereotyping. I was accepting that framing of it and just saying, no, I won't pick A, I'll pick B. But accepting that framing was actually true. And, I end up, many years later talking to a lot of people that I sort of knew on Facebook. And I'm like, wait a minute. This image I had in my head of these other Asian American kids, my parents' friends' kids, sort of representing my parents' culture, they were going through the same thing I was. They were reacting the same way I was. They were actually more like me than they were like me in that they didn't want to be like their parents or be defined by their parents. They're cool people, just like the friends that I directly had in school were. And so who knows? I could have found a soulmate maybe. If it's a possibility. It's a possibility that I just like rejected flat out of hand because I just decided, in this framework, this is what other Asian Americans mean to me, and that's something that I kind of regret because it's kind of colored. It kind of colored how I saw a whole group of people, was accepting a prejudice and just kind of flipping it instead of rejecting the prejudice, And I hear that.
Well, to be fair, nobody at the age of 15 or 16 is really looking for their soulmate that they're going to marry. And, another thing is, like, when your parents are like, you should totally date this person, that's the greatest way to make that person seem not cool, right? So, like, I don't think you should be that hard on yourself.
Right. But this is something like, a parallel I hear is from my Jewish friends, that there is this thing where, you get a lot of pressure to date inside the community, and then you rebel by pushing out. It's like, it's almost that's its own stereotype, right? On Seinfeld, they made a joke about it, Shik's appeal. Shik's is technically a slur, but no one seems to see it that way anymore. But like the so-called out marrying that when we say, oh, I'm being enlightened, I'm not seeing race by dating outside of my community. There's some unexamined stuff going in there. That by saying like I have to do that to like signal that I'm not seeing race, I'm still seeing race. You know what I mean? So it's
and that almost is like why I think for nearly a decade I was so reluctant to talk about my relationship, because I feel like there's almost it sounds so cliche to say you're colorblind or you're not colorblind, but there's like a large part of me that didn't think that the race of my partner said anything about me other than the person I happened to find myself compatible with, because, that happened, right? Like, I agree that a lot of people have racialized lenses when they're dating, and maybe I can't say for myself, only because, like I said, I have an N of 1, so I literally cannot, make any judgments about what I might or might not have done, or how he fits into a larger pattern of dating. But, like, it strikes me as, like, if you are saying that you're colorblind, but then you think that your relationship says something about you, then you absolutely are racializing it. I don't know about, you kind of have said this as well, but, like, maybe, when you're actually in the relationship, you don't really racialize it anymore. You're not like, I'm with so-and-so, and this makes me more progressive. You're just like, I'm with so-and-so because I like the way that you talk to me, over dinner or cooking, Like, I have a hard time really placing where race really fits into the personal is politic when it comes to your choice of partner. Like, does who I'm with really say all that much about the rest of my politic.
I mean, that's almost the thing is that these big things are the things will notice about you first, but they're almost the things you have the least control over. It's like, yeah, the fact that I'm with a white woman is because, on some level, it's because of my whole life and the fact that I went to a college that was predominantly white, that I hung out with a lot of white people, and that sort of increased the probability that I would meet her specifically. But it's at no point did I sit down like with OkCupid or wherever with a huge list of prospects and like winnow them out. Like the process by which I got with my wife was like the opposite of that. It was the least consciously planned or rationally decided thing that you could possibly. It was a long and convoluted story. And I think most of us are like that. And it's similar when you look at someone's like, why do you live in this place? Why don't you live somewhere else? Why do you work in this field? Why don't you do this other job? These big parts of your life, you have so little ability to like just sit down and say, this is what I'm going to do. You're pushed into them by so many factors. And that's the unfortunate thing. When we say the personal is political, it's not like, it's almost like that's from a very privileged perspective, that if you mean in the sense of choices, very few of us actually get to say, I want to live here and I want to do this for a living. Most of us don't. And so it's the other way around. It's like you have to acknowledge these political things have affected who I became, but I'm the one who was molded and shaped by those, the one who's making the decision and changing these things about me. Like the way I talk, the way I act, these are things that are, I'm an Americanized person, I'm an assimilated person, I've accepted that about myself, but I never decided, you know what, I'm going to be assimilated, I'm going to assimilate. No, that's how that's a decision that was made for me by all of the forces around me when I was a small child. And so for me to feel bad about that or to judge no, I should be more authentic in this way or that way, like I would have no way of choosing that, and it would be tremendously inauthentic for me to try to like force myself to behave in ways that I don't naturally feel like behaving, in order to fit some idea of how I should behave. It's just that I also can't say, oh, well, it's completely neutral that I don't like certain kinds of food. That's just coincidence. It has nothing to do with the fact that I was raised in a certain culture, and then, because if I do that, then I'm likely to start judging other people as saying, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do things the correct way? Because I assume that my way of doing things is not informed by where I came from. If that makes sense,
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing that you sort of picked up on a little bit is this idea that being in an interracial relationship seems to define the relationship, define the attraction of the two partners in a way that not a non-interracial relationship or a monoracial relationship is like. So let me give the example. Like, I feel like being in an interracial relationship, the assumption is made that issues of fetishism are important, or the race of my partner is some major factor in why I'm with this person. So, I'm expected to be dealing with or debunking or challenging myths of black masculinity, or he's expected to have to challenge yellow fever, as if this is some major issue for us, like that we have to sort of overcome and represent to people that we have an authentic relationship. It's not just about us fetishizing each other. And I feel like, on the one hand, I think that as an interracial couple, we do have to be aware of those issues as we encounter them, and how we fit into those preconceived notions. But on the other hand, it strikes me as odd because it's sort of predicated upon the assumption that there's something abnormal about our relationship, like not just like statistically abnormal, like culturally abnormal, and that there would be something sort of deviant about you, about wanting to be with someone who isn't like you racially or ethnically. And the sort of corollary to that is that I don't think that if I were Asian American and my partner were Asian American as well, people would be going like, well, you're only with so-and-so because you've got the fetish for Asian Americans and you must totally buy into the sexual stereotypes of your partner, because there would be an assumption that that would be quote-unquote normal for me. And I wonder if you sort of feel the same way, that even regardless of how you deal with your partner, there's a presumption within the community that you have to sort of defend your decision to be within the community, and that it almost always is defined as kind of abnormal.
Right.
You know?
That there's a sense that there was a default choice and you picked the
Right.
other than, which is, you know, if anything, that's the opposite. Like, I'm with my default choice. I can't imagine who else I would be with. You know, it would be that's what being in love is like. This is the person you're supposed to be with. This is the right choice. I would say, like, the thing that I think about is that when you're in an interracial relationship, some people notice race, and then for people who are in monoracial relationships, race becomes invisible. But if it's invisible, doesn't mean it's not there. And so to say that if it's a white guy and an Asian girl, then it must be like the Asian girl is being, you know, pushed into this box of, you know, Orientalist stereotypes. Well, those stereotypes still exist in an Asian couple. It's not like Asian women aren't expected to live up to certain stereotypes by Asian men. They are, and I've seen it. And if anything, a lot of the nasty rhetoric used by Asian men against white guy, Asian girl couples shows that they hold those stereotypes. You know.
Well, but more generic, sort of like not quite feminist, potentially misogynist stereotypes. Not just like against Asian women specifically. I feel like it's sort of
Right.
a general patina of misogyny.
Well, it actually, I think you can say there's some racialized stuff to it too. Like there's white guys and Asian guys alike who will like buy into this whole like, oh well, white girls are spoiled. White girls are spoiled by modernity. They're too, you know, they're spoiled by feminism. And you know, the right Asian girls that I'm looking for are the ones who are still like clinging to the old ways and who still know how to be a woman. And this is something that you hear from misogynistic Asian guys and white guys, and for all I know, black guys. Not in my experience, but who knows? But you know, like that logic. You know, you don't have to be white to accept that logic. It's a logic that's based in this sort of like colonialist rhetoric, but you can accept it no matter who you are. And it's like when you look at the supposed like fetishization of white women, and they say, oh well, you're into white women because you've been blasted with images of beautiful white women from Hollywood your whole life. You're looking for Barbie. You're not looking for a real woman. It's like, well, how is that only men of color? That's all men, right? White men have also been blasted by those images. White men who are into white women, you know, are also affected by Barbie, and they're not like, and that's not an unusual. It's like when who was it? The musician. The dude who, Your Body is a Wonderland. I'm blanking on his name randomly now. John Mayer. When John Mayer gave his interview and he was like, no, I only date white women. And it was like, you know, there's lots of white guys who only date white women. Like you can see they've only dated white women, but he made the mistake of saying it, right? And all of a sudden it was like, oh, he's racist. It's like, well, he said it, but how many white guys of his level of fame do you see who have also only dated white women? You know, it's not... Right. It's a thing that people do, and it's somehow only notable. If he were a black guy who said I only date white women, would have blown up 10 times as big, right? But it seems less of a big deal if it's within your own race, and if it's within your own race and you don't say anything about it, then no one will ever say anything about it, even though it's still the same phenomenon. You know, that's what gets me about it. You know.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's basically because you're interracial, people perceive race and therefore start to apply issues of race and maybe misapply them in a way that they don't apply them to because they're just not seeing racial issues. And so they assume if they see our races that we're seeing our races. It's just, you know, ultimately really interesting. I've met maybe like a handful of Asian American women with African American men in my life, and so it's always interesting to me to sort of talk about these issues. And I think for me, one of the things I wish we would talk about in the out marriage issue is this whole idea of the abnormal. I don't know if you deal with this, but like where I am, I currently live in an extremely monoracial place where neither Asian Americans nor African Americans are majority. And like, I don't know if you deal with this, but like, he and I are like, we're seen as regulars at everywhere we go because we're so noticeable. And so like they act like they know us when they've seen us maybe 3 times, but we're like, oh my God, we're that black Asian couple. And like, in everywhere we go, like restaurants, they always know what we order because we're so obvious or something. And it's just like those kinds of issues that I don't know. I feel like I'm like the only person that I know who really deals with this, and maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm just not hanging out in those communities or something. But it's like I feel like there's so much more to talk about in terms of interracial dating than whether or not we're buying into white male supremacy, which I feel like is basically how our community really talks about it.
Well,
Go ahead.
one thing that my wife said that actually kind of freaked me out a little while ago, because I had never thought about it that way, is, any kid we have, we're going to be parenting across racial boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
because um, because they will have to the kid will have to deal with some things from being multiracial that neither of us had to deal with, and I have to
Mm-hmm.
learn about things and she has to learn about things, and that's a big thing. It's big enough to think about a kid just like being another person you're responsible for, but to be responsible for this stuff that you kind of, I guess if you assume you're going to be in a monoracial family, you have the luxury of assuming, oh, their childhood's going to be like my childhood in that way. Even if, them being in a different generation means it's going to be different in a lot of ways, you don't think about that. But that kind of pushes it in your face that way. What if my child is
Right.
read as white and people don't see us as belonging together? That's an even bigger thing than, dating interracially, right? What if they're read as Asian and they see them and my wife as belonging together, you know? So, yeah.
Right. And like in my relationship, and then the hope that someday we're lucky enough to have kids as well, like, with the whole Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Ferguson stuff, one thing that's been on my mind, and that's been on the mind of a couple of other Asian American bloggers who are also, partnered with Black partners, like some of the writing that I've read has really been from that experience. Like I feel an extra, I feel invested in this. Obviously we should all feel invested in this because this is just sort of the moral and humane position of like maybe everybody's lives matters, including Black lives. Um, but like for me, what terrified me about the Michael Brown, Eric Garner thing, and Tamir Rice, and all of the incidents recently was that very much can and will be my child. Like it's very, very likely that my child will be read as biracially Black. And I, not that I feel like I'm ill-equipped, because, I fully expect that we're both going to be invested parents, but, this is a kind of thing where it sort of raises that issue now of like, how do I personally think about the issues of parenting someone who is biracial and biracially non-white? There's no possibility that this child is going to be read as white. So, like, driving while Black is a very real situation for my child, and those are the kinds of issues that if you're dealing with interracial relationships as only a person of color and a white person, that you don't really deal with.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's like,
So
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say in the last couple of minutes, one thing that came up and comes up repeatedly actually in my blog is it sort of goes back to that personal is political thing. You in the last year, it's sort of, the year of Arthur Chu as far as I'm concerned. I feel like your profile it's been raised amazingly in the last year, and kudos to you for that. And I think that when people think about sort of Asian American political leaders, they think about you. I'm lucky sometimes they think about me as well. But one thing that comes up is whether or not you have more or less ownership to being a voice of the Asian Americana based on the race of your partner. And one thing that I've been criticized of as an Asian American woman who's not partnered with an Asian American man is that my position as a quote unquote leader, which I don't know that I buy, is somehow suspect because it it raises kind of my own legitimacy as an Asian American. And I wonder if maybe we can tackle that in the final minutes of, authenticity of a person's own racial identity versus the race of the person that they're with.
Oh, well, I mean, the whole, like you said, banana versus fob thing is just, it's a huge can of worms. But I will say this, that, and, this is a sort of like, on behalf of Asian American guys, this is something terrible, but it's like, Asian American guys are so much more aggressive about policing that with Asian American girls. And it's because there's this bitterness, right? We see white men as having privilege, and we see Asian women as being able to grab some of that privilege because white men are willing to date them, and we see it as like, well, Asian guys can't do that because white girls won't date us. Well, but I definitely see like there are specific communities of Asian men that are like so like aggressive about it and nasty about it. And I'm sure some of them show up as trolls for you. The flip side, I don't see that so much. I have not had any Asian American women come up to me and tell me that I'm wrong for dating a white woman, and I think that's a kind of privilege.
Have you had any Asian American men like question your position relative? Like either say you don't belong as a voice of our community, or you're somehow additionally progressive because of that?
I've had a couple of for the most part, and this might speak to the weird hierarchy thing. For the most part, when I'm talking with well-meaning Asian American guys, it's a positive thing, and it's like, oh well, not like how'd you pull that off, but how do you deal with that? Because it's like, it's they see it as a positive thing. I'll leave it at that. I would say I've had some people approach me in bad faith about it. And ever since I got a lot of trolls, some of those trolls have been Asian American men. And a lot of it is just like, and it's people for like, reactionary, like Gamergate people, or politically reactionary people who just like, the goal is to like shut me up or to get me to leave the conversation. And so it's like, well, you're not really Asian, and it's like, you're a banana. It's like, straight up, you're a banana, and it's because of X, Y, and Z. It's because of the way you talk, it's because of the things you do, it's because of the friends that you have, it's because of where you live. Someone like looked up the town that I live in, and this is a 92% white town, what are you doing, that kind of thing. And it's because of who you're married to. And it's this very, lazy, easy, cheap shot kind of way to delegitimize someone. And I have actually been very open about it. I've said, like, everyone's experience is different. My experience is one that was characterized growing up. I was isolated from the Asian community. I was isolated from every community. I was an isolated person. And so I even, like, in high school, I think someone made a joke, like, there was like some scholarship for an ambassador from the Asian American community, and it's like, you're not a part of any community. Why would you be part of the Asian community? So it's funny in retrospect. But so yeah, I'm open about that. Like, I don't try to present myself as a voice for all Asian Americans, but I don't think my experience is, like, what does it mean to be really Asian American? If there's banana versus fob, then that really means that the first group of people is a large enough group of people to slur, right? Which means we are a community. And to say that the things that come from this cohort, the specific cohort of Asian Americans who were raised assimilationist by their parents because of the pressures their parents were in, well, it didn't really work. We're not really the same as white people. People can tell we're different. It is a different culture. It's not a better or worse culture, I think, than other cultures that you might call more authentic or not. But I don't think I'm speaking solely for myself. I think I, like everyone else, because I'm not that special. I'm the product of this cultural phenomenon that's been happening with the wave of immigration since the 60s. And it was actually very liberating for me as an adult to go back and learn about them and say, oh, all these things that I thought made me a freak, no, these are just like, this is what happened because of policies and pressures and, things, big historical things that happen. I'm just one of these people. And that was a liberating thing. And so I own that. I am who I am. It's not something I can change, so I'm not going to, and ultimately it's also like the things that I believe are things I like to think if I were a white guy, I would believe them. I like to think if I were anybody else, I would believe them, because the values that I hold are things that I might have a different perspective on it and might be more qualified to speak on some things, But I even wrote an article about, hey, you know, when you tell white people they're not allowed to be progressive or that they're not allowed to speak about things, that's one of those divide and conquer tactics. That's a shitty thing to do, and it's not right. It's not true. You know, a white person has as much right to be a decent person and hold decent values as anyone else, and that's what I think about. I think my wife is qualified to correct me when I get things wrong, even if they're things about race, because she is a human being who can see things, you know, and that's kind of where I leave that, you know.
Yeah. And that, by the way, was one of my favorite pieces that you wrote over the year, actually. And I think it was a little bit of a deviation from the subject matter you'd been covering, which has been a lot of Gamergate stuff. But I really, really enjoyed that piece because I feel like things have gotten in the progressive left online. Everything has become very simplified, and I do feel as if the white identity, how to be a white progressive, so suddenly became this issue where it was like the only role you had was to sit down and shut up. And I'm just not of that particular mold. I believe that everyone has something of value to offer to the conversation, even if they're not speaking from, even if they're speaking about an experience that's not their own. I don't think that means that they need to shut up. So I really appreciated that article. Honestly, in terms of the banana versus fob thing, I think that was going to be my next podcast episode anyways. So I'm not like I'm not putting you on the spot like I want to book you for the next episode or whatever, but I would love to have another hour on that, and that's mainly because I also have been accused of being inauthentically Asian by some folks very recently, and actually in the last couple of days it just really bothered me because I was starting to think about what does that really mean, and so I have a lot of thoughts on that, and I was actually shopping around for someone who might be interested in having that conversation, so I'm actually pretty excited that maybe we could do that as the next podcast.
Yeah, cool.
But I don't want to put you on the spot, so we'll talk about it after we stop broadcasting. So Arthur, I should wrap up because we are at about an hour and 20. I really want to thank you for coming out. I want to really quickly let you plug again where people can find you online to learn more about you. So where can we find you?
Yeah, well, I'm always on Twitter. That's at Arthur_Affect with an A-F-F-E-C-T. So Arthur_Affect, and you can find my writing on the Daily Beast and Salon if you do a search there. And I'm a freelancer, so you can find me everywhere. But I'm gonna get a better website. I'm gonna get a really cool website soon. It's just taking a while. So.
Planning on blogging at your own website or staying freelance for the larger blogs?
I'm planning on staying freelance for the larger blogs, mainly because they pay me to do it. But I'm planning on getting a website where I can at least, have an online presence where I can collate all this stuff, So.
Awesome. And if you're looking for me, I am Jen of Reappropriate.co, which is right here. You can find me on Twitter at @Reappropriate, which actually I think it goes this way. So @Reappropriate would be over here, I guess. Anyways, and thank you very much to the 2/3 viewers who streamed this podcast episode live through the whole hour and a half. Y'all are really troopers. And as it sounds like, hopefully we will book another episode. If it's not going to be with Arthur, it'll be possibly with James or someone else in the next couple of weeks. And I will post about it on the blog. But hopefully I can cement some details down and get maybe Arthur to come back and join us for a conversation about bananas versus fobs. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and tune in next week.